The Palace of Versailles was built to dazzle the world, a hall of mirrors designed not only to magnify light, but to blind those who gaze too long. Every marble column, every gilded ceiling, every garden aligned to the rising sun whispered of permanence and control. Yet behind its luminous surface, something unsettled lingered. How can a palace meant to embody divine order conceal shadows so deep that even centuries later the air around it feels heavy with secrets? The paradox rests in the contrast itself. The brighter the glow, the darker the unseen chambers behind it. Step through the gates in imagination and the splendor overwhelms. Fountains that sang like orchestrated stars, walls embroidered with gold, and corridors where courtiers moved like living ornaments of power. But beneath these scenes, messengers slipped through back passages with sealed letters destined for Rome, carrying words never meant for public hearing. Versailles was never just a palace. It was a stage, a mask, a radiant veil hiding the fragile strings that bound kings to an authority beyond their throne. When the mirrors reflected endless light, they also reflected endless concealment. The eyes that looked upon the palace saw glory, but its heart beat in silence, bound by treaties sworn in Vatican ink. History books dwell on Louis XIV, the Sun King, as if he were the architect of unshakable grandeur. But even the most brilliant sun can cast the longest shadow. The Bourbon dynasty projected strength, yet its foundations rested upon agreements whispered in cathedrals and carried in coded words. Some claimed these agreements were about faith, about the role of the Catholic Church in shaping nations. Others whispered they were bargains of survival, where the Vatican extended legitimacy and divine right in exchange for obedience cloaked beneath splendor. What was signed? Few ever saw. What was hidden? Perhaps only the Vatican archives still know. Yet the silence itself feels like proof of something too dangerous to acknowledge openly. Consider the timing. Versailles rose after the flames that consumed the Knights Templar. After Jacques de Molay cursed both king and pope as the fire licked his flesh, his final words promised ruin to the crown of France and its heirs, and to the Vatican as well. Centuries later, it is precisely a French dynasty, the Bourbons, that builds a palace of dazzling light while forging silent pacts with the Vatican. Could Versailles itself have been erected as a form of protection? A monument meant to dazzle away the curse, to bury memory under gold. And if so, why does the shadow of betrayal still echo within its walls, whispering that no amount of sunlight can erase a vow spoken in fire? Walk deeper into the Hall of Mirrors. The glass reflects endlessly, corridors bending into corridors, light multiplying until one loses all sense of direction. Yet mirrors have another power. They distort, they reverse, they trap. What did the courtiers see when they caught their own reflections? Did they feel the weight of ancient vows pressing behind them? The Vatican emissaries who walked among them wore plain robes, but behind those robes lay power greater than the gilded armor of any guard. Documents changed hands in candlelit chambers, sealed with rings that bore not the fleur-de-lis of France, but the seal of the fisherman. These were the true agreements that governed the fate of kingdoms. Versailles may have projected sovereignty, but the Vatican held the keys to its legitimacy. And in that exchange, the Bourbon crown glowed brightly, while the iron beneath remained hidden. The paradox sharpens when one recalls how obsessed the Bourbons were with staging control. Rituals at Versailles unfolded like clockwork. The king's rising, the meals, the processions, every gesture designed to convince the world that monarchy was divine theater. But theater requires a script, and someone beyond the stage often writes it. Who penned the words for this monarchy? Was it truly the Sun King? Or was it an invisible hand guiding through letters, concordats, and whispered absolutions from Rome? To believe the Bourbon crown stood unshaken on its own is to ignore the silence of entire centuries where critical documents simply vanished, where archives show gaps like wounds deliberately inflicted. Outside, the gardens stretched in infinite geometry, each path aligned with celestial order, as if Versailles itself were meant to mirror heaven. Yet what if heaven's reflection was manipulated? The Vatican claimed authority over the soul and, by extension, over the very order that Versailles sought to embody in stone. When Louis XIV proclaimed himself the Sun King, was it pride, or was it an echo of older solar cults absorbed into Catholic rites? Why do some processions at Versailles resemble processions of relics, once condemned as heresy, then later absorbed into papal ceremony? The palace seems to stand at the intersection of competing truths. Official history tells us of grandeur and divine right, yet the architecture hums with echoes of bargains made in secret. As centuries passed, the paradox only deepened. The Bourbons seemed untouchable, ruling France, Spain, and beyond. Their bloodline spread like a net across Europe, yet each triumph was shadowed by sudden collapses, assassinations, uprisings, and betrayals. Always the Vatican was nearby, sometimes blessing, sometimes withholding, but always present. One wonders if Versailles itself was less a palace than a prison of ritual, a golden cage designed to bind not only the courtiers but the dynasty itself, chained invisibly to vows no chronicler dared record. Brilliance of the mirrors concealed the cracks in the foundation. Perhaps the very act of dazzling the world was proof of insecurity, a desperate attempt to conceal what lay beneath the surface. The Bourbon throne leaned on shadows it could never escape. The paradox remains unsolved. Versailles, the symbol of control, became in time the very stage of downfall. When the revolution came, the gilded halls offered no protection. The mirrors shattered, the tapestries tore, and the king, who was once bathed in divine light, walked into the shadow of blades. Was this the curse of Jacques de Molay rippling through centuries until it reached its mark? Or was it simply the revelation that no agreement, however secret, can erase the truth forever? History as we know it chooses one explanation: political unrest, social inequity, hunger, revolution. Yet beneath that, another explanation waits, darker and quieter, insisting that Versailles itself was built not only as a palace of splendor, but as a monument to fear, a monument raised in the hope that gold could bury ancient vows of fire. The unanswered question persists like an echo in empty halls. Why did a dynasty so powerful, so radiant, feel compelled to hide behind pacts written in ink, never shown to the world? Why did the Vatican, already wielding spiritual supremacy, seek treaties that remained invisible even to the faithful? The silence of archives, the vanished decrees, the gaps in records, these are not accidents. They are patterns, deliberate absences, voids that tell a story louder than words. Versailles may shine in the sunlight of history books, but its shadows remind us of something deliberately erased. If the palace is a mirror, perhaps it reflects less of what was present and more of what was hidden, a void disguised in splendor. And so the paradox of Versailles endures. A palace built to immortalize light also immortalized absence. Its corridors echo not only with the footsteps of courtiers, but with the whispers of treaties sealed in secrecy, curses spoken in fire, and agreements swallowed by time. The mirrors still stand, reflecting endlessly, yet never revealing the hand that wrote the true script of history. To walk through them is to enter a labyrinth where every reflection raises the same quiet doubt. What lies behind the glass? And why was it kept from us? In hidden chambers, far from the golden corridors of Versailles, Bourbon kings placed their signatures on documents that the public was never meant to see. These were not the treaties paraded before Europe's ambassadors, adorned with seals and ribbons for ceremonial display. These were agreements sealed in Vatican ink, written in a language of obedience and silence, tucked away in archives that even now resist the light of disclosure. The paradox of Versailles' glitter lay not only in its opulence masking frailty, but in the very existence of a double record of history, one visible, one erased. What could be so dangerous that it demanded concealment across generations? The Vatican had long perfected the art of hidden concordance. To the faithful, it offered blessings and sacraments, but to rulers, it offered something more precious: legitimacy. A king might claim his power from birth, from the sword, or from the crown. But without the church, his authority was a fragile ornament, vulnerable to revolt and excommunication. And so the Bourbons, with their sprawling dominions and ambition for eternity, accepted pacts that ensured Rome's blessing while quietly binding themselves to obligations they could never admit. These obligations were not carved into monuments nor spoken in coronations, but written in codes of loyalty, absolutions traded for obedience, indulgences for silence. In the Vatican's ink, history itself was rewritten as a ledger of debt. Consider how certain Bourbon policies defied the very grandeur they projected. Kings who proclaimed absolute power suddenly reversed decrees, annulled edicts, or allowed entire archives to vanish as if swallowed by a tide. These reversals often coincided with papal pressure, a gesture unseen by the masses but undeniable in pattern. A decree against the Jesuits disappears. A financial reform dissolves. An alliance breaks apart without explanation. The visible record calls it politics, yet the timing whispers of obligations owed to another authority. The treaties themselves remain unseen, but the shadows they cast are etched across history like invisible handwriting. It is said that within the Apostolic Palace, vaults run deeper than cathedrals, chambers filled not with relics of saints, but with locked drawers of paper, each a testament to rulers who bent their crowns to Rome. What Bourbon decrees lie there, bound in ribbon, sealed with wax, never opened since the day they were signed. Was Louis XIV's claim of divine right strengthened not by heaven itself, but by signatures exchanged in secret chambers, witnessed by cardinals sworn to silence? And if so, what did those signatures cost? Perhaps obedience in matters of war, perhaps concessions in lands and laws, perhaps even the souls of subjects offered as payment in the ledger of faith. The imagery of ink itself is telling. Ink can preserve, but ink can also obscure. The blackness of Vatican ink flowed into treaties designed to be unseen. Agreements never proclaimed in Versailles' glittering halls, yet ink fades, parchment ages, and secrecy breeds suspicion. If these documents had been innocent, why hide them in shadows while displaying every other victory in blazing light? Why allow centuries of speculation rather than reveal their words? The very act of concealment is testimony to danger. Danger not to faith, but to the narrative that history insists upon. From the perspective of the Bourbon dynasty, secrecy was survival. The church wielded power that no army could confront, the threat of spiritual ruin, the withdrawal of divine legitimacy. Kings might command soldiers, but the Vatican commanded the belief that made those soldiers loyal enough to secure Versailles' splendor. The Bourbons traded in unseen coin, offering promises, alliances, even betrayals in return for the church's blessing. The irony is profound. The palace that appeared as the ultimate symbol of sovereignty was tethered to Rome by invisible ink. There were whispers even at the time. Courtiers spoke of envoys arriving under cover of darkness, clerics slipping through corridors to carry documents not destined for the royal archives. In the salons of Paris, some dared to suggest that the king's power was not absolute but conditional, that Versailles itself was a gilded stage masking a pact already written. Those whispers rarely survived, for the price of speaking was high, yet they ripple through diaries, letters, and fragmented accounts that hint at a larger truth. The silence in the official record is loudest where these whispers appear. Gaps in documents, unexplained erasures, treaties announced and then forgotten. The deeper irony is that the Vatican itself cloaked these pacts under the language of salvation, to shield the dynasty, to preserve faith, to unify Christendom. Such words justified what was, in essence, an exchange of control. But salvation is never without cost. In the Bourbon story, the cost appears as instability, as the slow erosion of authority. Even as Versailles glittered brighter, each hidden treaty bought peace for a moment, but accumulated debt for a future reckoning. That reckoning arrived not only in revolution, but in the suspicion that history itself had been sculpted by unseen agreements. Imagine the scene: a candlelit chamber, the king seated at a desk, quill poised above parchment. A cardinal stands nearby, bearing the weight of Rome's authority. The ink glistens dark as night as signatures mark the unseen bargain. Outside, the palace shines. Music echoes, fountains rise in luminous arcs. Inside, history bends in silence, not by sword or crown, but by words never meant to surface. This is the image that lingers. Two worlds in one. The world of spectacle and the world of secrecy, bound together in a paradox so sharp it cuts through centuries. And what of us? Centuries later, we walk through Versailles and marvel at mirrors, gardens, and ceilings painted with gods, yet we feel the emptiness beneath. We sense that the palace was not merely a monument to power, but a monument to concealment. The Vatican archives remain closed, the treaties sealed, the ink fading in silence. Yet the absence itself whispers louder than revelation. History offers us Versailles' light, but shadows remind us that entire chapters were written in darkness. This leads us to the unavoidable suspicion. Were these hidden pacts the true foundation of Bourbon power? And if so, why were they erased from memory? Did the Vatican conceal them to protect the Church? Or did the Bourbons conceal them to protect themselves? Or perhaps both knew that exposure would unravel the illusion of divine monarchy, revealing it instead as a fragile bargain struck in fear of a curse still echoing from the flames of Jacques de Molay. The treaties remain unseen, but the silence around them has become its own kind of evidence. On a cold March evening in the year 1314, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was led to his fate upon an island in the Seine. Jacques de Molay, bound and aged, stood before a fire prepared to erase him from the living world. Yet instead he chose to leave a mark that would outlast stone and sword. As the flames began to rise, he turned not to his executioners, but to the heavens, calling upon God to summon both Pope Clement and King Philip of France to judgment before the year was done. It was not a plea, it was a curse. And in the months that followed, both Pope and King were dead, leaving behind whispers that his vow had been fulfilled. From that moment, France carried not only the stain of betrayal, but the weight of a malediction that seemed to coil around its monarchy for centuries. The story of the Templars is one of paradox, for they were knights sworn to protect the Holy Land, yet they grew into a power that rivaled kings themselves. They controlled wealth, land, and secrets said to reach back to Jerusalem, to relics too dangerous for ordinary faith. When Philip the Fair, desperate for money and control, turned against them, the Vatican acquiesced and the order was erased in blood and fire. Yet can an order so entwined with legend and power truly be destroyed by flames? Perhaps the men perished, but the vow of their Grand Master lingered like smoke that never clears. If his words could summon ruin upon both king and pope in the same year, what else might they summon across generations? Centuries later, the Bourbon dynasty found itself ruling the very kingdom that had condemned the Templars. They inherited not only the crown, but also the curse. Versailles gleamed with gold, but beneath its foundations ran the memory of fire. Every Bourbon king who signed hidden pacts with the Vatican did so in the shadow of Jacques de Molay's vow, perhaps unknowingly confirming its reach. For the Vatican had escaped the flames as well, complicit in the betrayal, yet surviving to wield greater power. It was as though both crown and papacy were bound together by the words spoken at the pyre, an invisible chain forged in fire, never broken. Legends tell of omens surrounding the Bourbon line, strange deaths and sudden reversals that seem to echo the curse, one king struck by illness before his time, another undone by scandal that erupted without warning, yet another whose authority withered despite apparent strength. Rational history calls these coincidences. But do coincidences repeat themselves so persistently, echoing like a drumbeat through centuries? The revolution that finally shattered the Bourbon throne was drenched in fire and blood, eerily mirroring the pyre of 1314. As the guillotine claimed Louis XVI, some whispered that the curse had reached its final mark, fulfilling a prophecy of ruin, not through divine will, but through human vengeance magnified by centuries of silence. The Vatican, too, bore marks of this legacy. Pope Clement had died within a month of de Molay's vow, his successor dying soon after, leaving the papacy in turmoil. And yet, instead of breaking from the curse, the Church became its co-author, shaping history alongside monarchs who feared and relied upon it in equal measure. The hidden treaties between Bourbon kings and Rome can be seen as attempts to placate not only the Vatican, but also the curse itself. Bargains made to buy legitimacy, perhaps even to buy protection from words that no fire could erase. If the curse was real, then each pact was an act of desperation, a hedge against forces that kings could neither deny nor confront openly. Consider the symbolism. The Templars had been guardians of secrets, accused of heresy for knowledge too dangerous for the Church to admit. The Bourbons, centuries later, became guardians of a different kind of secret, one written not in relics, but in agreements hidden from the world. One order destroyed, another dynasty bound, and both tied to the Vatican, which stood as both betrayer and benefactor. If the curse of de Molay lingered, perhaps it was not simply a supernatural vow, but a reminder that betrayal of truth breeds consequences that unfold long after the flames die out. Even within Versailles, subtle echoes of the Templar legacy appear. The palace's obsession with geometry, symbolism, and solar imagery recalls the esoteric traditions said to have been preserved by the order. The black and white marble floors mirror the Templar colors, light and shadow entwined. Did the Bourbons consciously weave these symbols into their palace, or did they emerge as subconscious acknowledgments of a debt unpaid? One wonders if the grandeur of Versailles was itself a response to the curse, to overwhelm it with light, to bury it beneath spectacle, to deny its reach by projecting invulnerability. Yet the more brilliantly the palace shone, the more fragile its foundations seemed to become. The endurance of the curse raises a larger question. Was it truly supernatural, or was it history itself acting with a memory sharper than any blade? When power betrays those who guard its deepest secrets, does not history itself conspire to undo the betrayer? The Templars may have fallen, but their story lived on in whispers, fueling doubts and suspicions that weakened the very crown that sought to erase them. The Vatican may have survived, but at the cost of binding itself to dynasties that would crumble in spectacular ruin. In this sense, de Molay's curse was more than words. It was a prophecy written into the structure of power itself, a law of consequence that no treaty could erase. And so the Bourbon kings, despite their grandeur, lived in the long shadow of fire. Their alliances with the Vatican promised legitimacy, yet also chained them to the very institution complicit in the betrayal of the Templars. Versailles was a palace of light, but beneath that light smoldered embers centuries old. The curse, whether mystical or historical, threaded through their reigns, whispering that no dynasty, however splendid, can escape the weight of broken vows. Each treaty signed in secrecy, each indulgence exchanged, each silence enforced was another echo of that night in 1314, when a man in chains called down judgment on both crown and church. What remains is the haunting possibility that the revolution itself, the downfall of the Bourbons in fire and blood, was not only a political upheaval, but the final fulfillment of that curse. The king who died beneath the guillotine's blade was not only a victim of revolution, but a descendant of those who betrayed the guardians of forgotten truths. In that moment, the vow of Jacques de Molay seemed to pass through centuries and reach its mark, leaving us to wonder whether history unfolds by accident or by patterns written in fire and sealed in silence. The union of thrones and altars was never merely a political arrangement. It was ritual. The Bourbon dynasty perfected the art of turning marriages into ceremonies that cloaked diplomacy beneath the veil of sanctity. Brides crossed borders with dowries, treaties folded within their wedding chests. While altars bore witness to vows that seemed holy, they bound kingdoms in chains more binding than any battlefield victory. Each union served as a bridge between blood and faith. Yet beneath the fragrance of roses lingered the metallic taste of sacrifice. For in every marriage, someone was offered, a daughter, a kingdom, an heir upon the altar of alliance. The church sanctified these marriages, sprinkling holy water upon what were in truth contracts of survival. Papal blessings transformed dynastic bargains into sacred unions, convincing subjects that heaven itself approved. Yet the secrecy of certain vows suggests that not all was spoken before the congregation. In whispered Latin, promises may have been made that bound not only the couple but the crown itself to obedience. These hidden vows were as much about control as about sanctity, and in them the Vatican extended its invisible hand deeper into Bourbon veins. Thus, each marriage became more than a celebration. It was an initiation, a sacrifice dressed in white, masking chains beneath lace. Consider the fates of these royal brides. Many found themselves pawns in games larger than life, trapped within gilded cages, their bodies and wombs serving as instruments of continuity. Some died young, some vanished into obscurity, and some bore heirs who carried both the splendor of crowns and the burden of invisible vows. Each life reflects a pattern: sacrifice concealed beneath ceremony, sorrow hidden behind velvet curtains. Were these simply the tragedies of courtly life, or echoes of an older ritual, as though the dynasty itself were reenacting sacrifices to appease an ancient curse? Versailles, with its vast chapels and endless corridors, became the theater for these sacred performances. The masses saw radiant queens entering in procession, candles gleaming against marble, choirs echoing heavenly approval. Yet in the shadows, behind carved altars, letters sealed with Vatican ink awaited signatures. The union of bride and groom was mirrored by the union of crown and church, each reinforcing the other in spectacle and in secrecy. To the public, these were celebrations of divine order. To those who signed in hidden rooms, they were acts of submission, confirmations that the crown still bent toward Rome. Patterns emerge when the line of marriages is traced. Alliances with Spain, with Austria, with Italian duchies, all orchestrated under Vatican guidance, all weaving their Bourbon identity into a web that transcended borders. Each union bound them more tightly to Rome's influence, ensuring that no matter how radiant Versailles appeared, its sovereignty was hemmed by vows that reached across Europe. A map of Bourbon marriages becomes less a genealogy than a tapestry of obedience, threads connecting thrones to cathedrals in patterns too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. The metaphor of sacrifice becomes sharper when examined alongside the Templar curse. The order destroyed in fire had once vowed chastity, poverty, and obedience, vows broken by betrayal. Now, centuries later, Bourbon queens became vessels of obedience, their unions sanctified by the same church that had betrayed knights in chains. Was this a reenactment, a form of ritual recompense? The dynasty offering daughters in place of knights to pay a debt never erased? If so, then each marriage ceremony was not only a political event, but a ritual sacrifice, binding the dynasty deeper into the shadow of the vow spoken in fire. Within diaries and memoirs, hints surface. Queens wrote of isolation, of prayers unanswered, of the weight of ceremonies that felt more like bindings than blessings. Ambassadors noted how papal nuncios lingered after weddings, holding private audiences with kings that produced no records. Priests assigned to royal households reported sudden transfers or silences after serving confessions. These fragments suggest that marriage was only the visible part of a larger ritual, the surface of an ocean concealing depths too dangerous to explore. History records the processions, but silence devours what followed behind closed doors. To understand the Bourbon line is to see that power was not secured solely by armies or wealth, but by the theater of obedience performed at every altar. Weddings became renewal ceremonies, moments when the dynasty reaffirmed its pact with Rome, disguising submission as celebration. Every child born of these unions carried bloodlines interwoven with oaths, heirs destined to rule but already bound before birth. The splendor of Versailles masked the fact that the very future of the dynasty was written in ink and ritual far from public view. This raises a question with no simple answer. Were the Bourbons masters of spectacle or victims of it? They staged themselves as divine, wrapped in sunlight and gold, yet every alliance stitched them tighter to an authority that could never be acknowledged openly. By presenting marriages as sacred unions, they convinced their subjects of heaven's favor while quietly paying the price of obedience beneath the same altars. Versailles thus became both sanctuary and snare, a palace where love was proclaimed but power was sacrificed, where each union confirmed not freedom but chains. The paradox of blood ties and broken altars lingers. Behind every radiant bride was a dynasty seeking survival, and behind every blessing was a Vatican hand guiding the script. Were these unions mere diplomacy dressed as devotion? Or was something older at work, an echo of vows broken centuries earlier, now exacting payment in human lives and royal futures? The question remains unanswered, suspended like incense smoke in the chapels of Versailles, where light dazzles but shadows deepen. In the silence after midnight, when Versailles slept beneath its canopy of stars, there were gatherings that history barely dares to mention. Not the lavish feasts of courtiers, not the celebrated spectacles of music and theater, but hushed councils where Bourbon envoys met Vatican emissaries away from the prying eyes of chroniclers. These were the forbidden councils convened not in radiant halls, but in secluded chambers where the words spoken were never meant to echo beyond stone walls. No proclamations announced them, no decrees preserved them, and yet their existence is betrayed by fragments scattered like broken glass across time. What purpose could these councils serve when so many treaties were already displayed in the light? Their secrecy suggests matters that could not withstand exposure, agreements whose very revelation would unravel the illusion of sovereignty to the Bourbon kings. These nocturnal encounters were necessary, for they offered what no army or treasury could secure: the assurance of legitimacy sanctified by Rome. To the Vatican, they provided leverage, invisible threads by which monarchs were guided, ensuring that even the Sun King's brilliance could never escape the shadow of the fisherman's ring. The public saw golden processions, but power was bartered in whispers, lit by candle flames flickering against parchment. Consider the recurring pattern of sudden shifts in policy that followed such meetings. Edicts announced by morning were reversed within weeks. Alliances proclaimed were dissolved without explanation. Religious orders were suppressed only to reappear under papal blessing. Each reversal was presented as pragmatic politics, yet the timing often coincided with the quiet presence of Vatican legates at court. Diaries of courtiers hint at late-night gatherings, noting how certain ministers entered chambers and emerged pale, their decisions altered as if by invisible command. It was as though the council chamber itself became an altar, where sovereignty was offered as sacrifice, leaving behind no trace but the silence of compliance. Legends persist of one particular gathering deep beneath a cathedral linked by tunnels to Versailles, where envoys exchanged relics as tokens of agreement. A fragment of a saint's bone, a chalice said to have touched Jerusalem, relics whose authenticity mattered less than the symbolism they carried. In such exchanges, the Bourbon crown was reminded that its legitimacy flowed not from sunlight alone, but from blood and bone, guarded by Rome. Whether these stories are exaggeration or truth, their persistence reveals the suspicion that something unholy was entwined with the holy, that alliances were bound not merely by ink, but by ritual steeped in dread. The forbidden councils also intersect with the legacy of the Templar curse. It was within hidden chambers, after all, that Philip the Fair and Clement Futh had plotted the downfall of the knights. The very architecture of secrecy carried echoes of that betrayal, and in repeating the pattern, the Bourbons may have stepped into the same cycle of doom. If de Molay's words had bound crown and pope to judgment, then each secret council was a reenactment of the crime, each whispered agreement another link in the chain of inevitability. Versailles mirrors glittered in daylight, but beneath them smoldered fires unseen, rekindled by every clandestine pact. What dangers did the councils conceal that required such elaborate silence? Some speculate they involved the redistribution of wealth between crown and church, the secret handling of debts that threatened to reveal the monarchy's fragility. Others whisper of more esoteric matters, the transfer of forbidden texts, the suppression of discoveries that could undermine doctrine, the burial of histories too dangerous for public knowledge. In this view, the councils were not only political but curatorial, guardians of memory, deciding which truths would be erased and which permitted to endure. If so, then the erasures in Bourbon history are not accidents, but deliberate acts agreed upon beneath candlelit arches where oaths sealed silence tighter than stone. The Jesuits often appear in the shadows of these accounts, their influence vast yet obscured by obedience. As confessors, advisors, and scholars, they carried knowledge between Rome and Versailles with subtle precision, shaping decisions without leaving fingerprints. Their presence at forbidden councils was almost inevitable, though their records vanish as though swallowed by the same vaults that guard the treaties. Were they the scribes of these agreements or the architects? Did they merely witness, or did they steer kings toward choices already decreed in Rome? History leaves the question open, but the consistency of their proximity is itself a testimony to their role. Imagine the atmosphere of these councils. The hour is late, candles burning low. The scent of wax hangs thick in the air. Shadows gather at the edges of the chamber, cloaking faces in half-light. A king's envoy leans forward, parchment unfurled, while a cardinal murmurs conditions in Latin. The quill scratches. Wax seals melt. Silence deepens. Outside, Versailles glows in moonlight, serene and eternal. But inside this chamber, history is being shaped in whispers no one will ever read. This is where power was forged, not in open sunlight, but in secret nights, where crowns bent to Rome not in ceremony, but in silence. The paradox of these councils is that they are invisible, yet their effects are undeniable. Their absence in archives speaks louder than any record, for the gaps themselves are proof of erasure. When edicts vanish, when policies reverse, when history bends inexplicably, the shadow of the Forbidden Council falls across the page. To deny their existence is to explain away too many absences, too many silences, too many abrupt changes that leave no trace. The Bourbon dynasty shines in history books as if it stood alone, but in truth its sovereignty was entangled in gatherings that left behind nothing but whispers. And so the question remains suspended in the silence. What was truly spoken in those chambers, and why was it hidden? Were these councils acts of survival, attempts to shield a dynasty from forces too great to confront openly? Or were they acts of submission, confessions of weakness before an authority that reigned beyond thrones and crowns? The answers lie not in what we can see, but in the voids deliberately preserved. The Forbidden Council endures not as a record, but as an absence, a silence that whispers louder than words, reminding us that behind every gleam of Versailles was a night of secrecy no light was ever allowed to touch. The world remembers Louis XIV as the Sun King, a monarch who bent Europe to his will and built Versailles into a palace that became the very emblem of divine power. Yet the mask he wore was not made of sunlight alone. Beneath the glitter of mirrors and the perfection of gardens lay a burden that could never be spoken. Debts to Rome, obligations owed to the Vatican, bargains signed in ink darker than night. Versailles was not only a palace of glory. It was a theater where rituals concealed the price of survival, where every display of light was designed to hide the chains binding the Bourbon throne. The coronation of Louis XIV was staged as a triumph of divine order. Oil anointed him. Choirs proclaimed him chosen. The people believed the ceremony was heaven's approval. But what remained unseen were the agreements signed long before the crown touched his head, conditions dictated by the Vatican to ensure obedience. The mask of the Sun King was carefully crafted, for he could dazzle the people only because he had already accepted the invisible script handed to him by Rome. His light was borrowed, and every beam of splendor reflected not independence, but compliance. Versailles itself was constructed as a monument of control, with every stone arranged to declare the absolute sovereignty of the king. Yet, the more the palace projected independence, the more dependent it became on the blessing of the church. Without papal approval, the Sun King's light would have been eclipsed by excommunication, his divine aura shattered in an instant. It is no coincidence that his reign saw relentless efforts to secure papal support, to negotiate concessions that would allow him to project autonomy while remaining tethered to Rome. The theater of Versailles was therefore less a fortress of independence than a mask concealing hidden debt. Consider how Louis XIV persecuted certain religious minorities, revoking toleration with the Edict of Fontainebleau, an act that seemed to demonstrate royal authority, but also echoed Vatican demands. Thousands fled, yet the monarchy claimed strength. Was this the king's decision, or was it Rome's commands spoken through a hidden channel? Such measures suggest the latter, for the timing coincided with papal pressures designed to reinforce Catholic supremacy. Behind the mask of power, the Sun King obeyed, cloaking submission in the theater of sovereignty. Rituals at Versailles reinforced this mask. The king's rising and retiring became spectacles, daily ceremonies where courtiers worshipped the monarch as if he were a living sun. Yet even these rituals bore shadows. Observers noted the presence of priests whispering blessings, advising the king on the order of gestures as if the sacred and the political were being choreographed in unison. It was theater, but theater directed by invisible playwrights, its scripts written not in marble, but in Vatican ink. The mask was convincing, but it was still a mask. Debt also played its part. The wars of the Sun King drained coffers, forcing him into financial entanglements that could not always be resolved through taxation or conquest. The Vatican, with its vast networks of wealth and influence, offered relief, but at a cost. Hidden treaties bound him to conditions that rarely reached public ears. Some speak of concessions over bishop appointments, others of obedience in matters of doctrine. Whatever the details, the outcome was the same. Versailles' brilliance stood upon foundations mortgaged to Rome. The paradox deepens when one studies the iconography of Versailles. The palace proclaimed Louis as Apollo, the sun god, master of light and order. Yet this imagery is steeped in older traditions absorbed by the church, a blending of pagan and Christian symbols. Was the king truly Apollo reborn, or was he a vessel through which Rome projected its ability to sanctify earthly rule? The mask of the Sun King may have dazzled his court, but its design carried traces of Vatican influence. Its beams refracted the hidden alliance between crown and altar. Contemporaries sensed the paradox. Even then, writers, philosophers, and courtiers whispered that Versailles was a prison of rituals, a golden cage in which the king performed divinity but lived bound by obligations he could never confess. The grandeur that seemed unshakable was in fact fragile, for it depended not only on armies and wealth, but on agreements concealed from the people. The Vatican's hand lay hidden behind every gesture, every decree, every ritual, invisible but undeniable. When we look at Versailles today, its splendor remains overwhelming, yet silence hangs in its halls. The mirrors reflect endless light, but they also reflect emptiness, as though their brilliance was designed to keep us from noticing what was absent. The mask of the Sun King was never removed, for history itself perpetuated it, repeating the image of sovereign independence while concealing the debts owed to Rome. But the cracks in the mask are visible to those who look closely. Sudden reversals in policy, vanished decrees, and the persistent whisper of the Vatican's presence. The story of Louis XIV's mask is not only about one king, but about a dynasty. For in crafting the image of the Sun King, the Bourbons also revealed their vulnerability. Their power lay in spectacle, yet spectacle is fragile, always one revelation away from collapse. The Vatican understood this fragility and used it, binding the dynasty ever deeper into pacts that would outlast the king himself. Versailles shone brighter than any palace before it, but its brilliance was already marked by shadow. Thus, the Mask of the Sun King endures as one of history's greatest paradoxes, a monarch remembered as absolute, sovereign, and divine, yet bound by debts and treaties hidden from the world. A palace that declared independence, yet whispered obedience, a light that dazzled, but only by concealing darkness. To walk the halls of Versailles is to witness the performance of sovereignty, brilliant, theatrical, unforgettable. Yet beneath it lies the silence of obligations no sunlight could ever reveal. The flames that consumed the Templars in 1314 did not end with ashes. They left behind a vow that spread like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. Centuries later, when the Bourbon line rose to its golden heights, the memory of that fire reappeared in tragedies that seemed to carry the shape of retribution. Each time the dynasty appeared strongest, calamity struck, sudden deaths, rebellions, betrayals, wars that drained the treasury, and thrones toppled despite splendor. Chroniclers recorded these events as politics or misfortune, but in the pattern of repetition, one feels the presence of something older, something spoken in fire and bound in silence. The oath of Jacques de Molay, declared in agony, had become an echo the Bourbons could never silence. The Bourbon kings may never have spoken of the curse openly, yet their actions suggest its shadow haunted them. Why else cling so tightly to the Vatican, weaving alliance after alliance, as if the Church itself might intercede against an ancient vow? Why else pursue rituals and consecrations with such desperation, seeking absolution not once, but again and again? Perhaps in every hidden treaty, in every secret council, there was an unspoken hope that obedience to Rome could break the cycle of fire. But if that was their belief, it betrayed a misunderstanding. For it was the Vatican's complicity in the Templars' betrayal that first gave the curse its power, binding Pope and King alike to the judgment of history. Consider the fate of Louis Philippe, heir to the Sun King. His reign began with optimism, yet was marred by scandal, financial ruin, and a court riddled with intrigue. Though Versailles still glittered, France sank deeper into instability. His death by smallpox, a disease that disfigured the monarch even as he lived, seemed a cruel echo of de Molay's vow. The king's body was consumed not by flame but by infection, leaving behind horror and decay. Was this merely illness, or another flicker of the pyre's embers, claiming its due from a dynasty bound to a centuries-old judgment? The revolution that later engulfed Louis carried the curse into its most violent form. Crowds stormed Versailles, symbols of monarchy shattered, and the king who once presided over feasts walked to the guillotine. The blade fell, and blood soaked the earth where once the Templars had burned. Many whispered then that de Molay's oath had found its final fulfillment. The Vatican too was shaken, for the revolution threatened not only monarchy but the Church itself. Both institutions, bound together in secrecy, collapsed into the judgment once prophesied by a dying knight. The Bourbon tragedies, however, were not limited to France. Branches of the dynasty in Spain and Italy faced their own turmoil, wars, succession crises, and uprisings that mirrored the instability of their French cousins. The curse seemed to follow the bloodline wherever it spread, as though the vow had been etched into the very veins of the family. It was not one throne that suffered, but an entire dynasty, echoing the breadth of de Molay's condemnation. The king and his heirs, the pope and his successors, all were named, and all felt the fire in time. Versailles itself bore signs of this haunting. Amid its gilded ceilings and glittering mirrors, subtle cracks appeared, walls required repair, fountains fell silent, tapestries faded faster than expected. Visitors spoke of an atmosphere heavy with foreboding, as though the palace itself carried knowledge of an impending reckoning. While the world marveled at the Sun King's creation, those who walked its halls in the final years whispered of unease, of grandeur that felt hollow, of a light dimmed by an invisible shadow. The fire of 1314 seemed to burn quietly beneath marble floors, awaiting its chance to erupt once more. Some historians dismiss the curse as superstition, yet even they cannot deny the strange symmetry. A knight condemned in fire names his enemies, and within the span of centuries their heirs collapse in blood. The Vatican survives but loses moral authority. Monarchy reigns in splendor but dies in humiliation. Coincidence may explain one event, perhaps two, but a chain stretching across generations resists such dismissal. The oath in ashes endures because it aligns with the pattern of collapse, a whisper reminding us that history carries memory as embers carry heat. What is most unsettling is not whether the curse was real, but whether it was necessary. Perhaps the very act of betrayal planted the seed of downfall, and the curse was only its spoken form. To destroy the Templars, Crown and Church conspired, sacrificing loyalty to preserve power. In that act, they revealed their fragility, and fragility, once exposed, spreads like fire. The Bourbons inherited the fruits of that betrayal, and in doing so, they inherited its price. The oath in ashes was not merely a supernatural threat, it was the truth of consequence disguised as prophecy. And so the Bourbon dynasty, however brilliant, was shadowed by an oath they could never unmake. Their splendor was always temporary, their victories always provisional. For behind every triumph waited the fire of memory. Versailles was their fortress, their mask, their monument, but even it could not escape the weight of vows spoken long before its stones were set. To this day, the oath lingers, not in archives, but in the air of history, whispering that no betrayal is ever truly buried and no fire is ever truly extinguished. Within the labyrinth of power that linked Versailles to Rome, no order played a subtler role than the Jesuits. They were confessors, teachers, diplomats, and spiritual advisors. Their presence was woven into the very fabric of Bourbon rule. To the public, they were men of devotion, guardians of faith and education. To the kings, they were something more dangerous, invisible guides whose influence seeped into decisions of war, marriage, and governance. The Jesuits did not rule openly, yet their hand was felt in every corner of the dynasty's story, shaping events with a precision that left no trace. This is why many suspected their presence in the most secret councils, their influence hidden behind masks of humility. The labyrinth they wove was not of stone, but of obedience. Each Jesuit swore allegiance not to any crown but to the papacy, a vow that placed them beyond the reach of kings. A Bourbon monarch might imagine himself master of his realm, but in the chamber of confession kneeling before a Jesuit, secrets spilled, sins confessed, fears revealed, all of it carried quietly to Rome through channels no soldier could intercept. The crown wore gold, but the Jesuits carried keys, unlocking the king's soul and binding it with chains invisible to the eye. Versailles projected sovereignty. Yet within its chapels, the dynasty bent to voices that whispered of higher authority. Contemporaries both feared and admired them. Their schools shaped the minds of princes. Their sermons inspired obedience, and their presence at court was constant. Yet rumors persisted that they acted as shadows of the Vatican, steering kings through advice that seemed spiritual but was in truth political. A king's decision to wage war, to reform finance, to suppress a rival order, all might trace back to counsel given in whispers behind closed doors. When royal decrees aligned too neatly with papal interests, suspicion grew that the Jesuit labyrinth had directed the course. Even when banished, they found their way back, as if their influence could never be erased. The irony is striking. The Bourbon dynasty, eager to project independence, became entangled in a web spun by men who claimed no throne, no land, no army. Their power lay in obedience to Rome. And in that obedience, they wielded control greater than that of ministers or generals. The labyrinth they created ensured that no Bourbon king could ever fully escape the Vatican's shadow. Every confession, every sermon, every lesson was a thread in a network designed to guide monarchs toward choices already decreed by another authority. Versailles may have been a palace of mirrors, but within those mirrors lay reflections already shaped by Jesuit hands. The fear of their influence led to repeated attempts at suppression. In France, Spain, and elsewhere, Bourbon rulers issued edicts expelling them, blaming them for unrest or manipulation. Yet these expulsions never lasted. The labyrinth adapted, reformed, re-entered through different doors, and soon the Jesuits returned, their influence stronger than before. The very act of suppression seemed to prove their power. For kings could not sustain resistance without unraveling their own legitimacy. The Vatican's relentless defense of the order made it clear that obedience to Rome required obedience to the Jesuit presence. Thus, the labyrinth endured. Invisible yet indestructible within Versailles itself. Their influence manifested in rituals that seemed ordinary but carried hidden weight. Masses conducted with subtle emphasis. Sermons reminding courtiers of obedience. Confessions where secrets of state intertwined with sins of conscience. The Jesuits blurred the boundary between spiritual and political, turning every act of faith into an act of governance. For a king to resist them was to risk not only his soul but his throne. For Rome stood behind them, ready to withdraw legitimacy if defiance became too bold. The labyrinth was therefore not only spiritual but existential, binding monarchs to choices they could neither admit nor escape. The Templar curse also echoes here, for if the oath of ashes bound crown and pope, the Jesuits became the living instrument of that bond. They ensured the curse continued by weaving obedience into every layer of monarchy, reminding kings of their vulnerability, steering them toward the very bargains that deepened their chains. Whether knowingly or not, they became guardians of the silence, protectors of the hidden treaties, keepers of the labyrinth in which Versailles itself became entangled. Their presence was the echo of betrayal made flesh, a continuation of patterns set in fire centuries before. What makes the labyrinth most disturbing is its invisibility. Armies march, treaties are signed, revolutions erupt, all visible to history. But the subtle influence of confessors, the whispered words that shifted decisions, left no trace. We sense their presence in the gaps, in sudden reversals, in decisions too convenient for Rome. We see the labyrinth not in stone, but in absence, in the way history bends without explanation, in the way sovereignty dissolves quietly without battle. It is a power that hides itself by never appearing, a control so complete it requires no acknowledgement. Even today, the legacy of that labyrinth lingers. The Jesuits remain associated with secrecy, with influence that stretches beyond borders, with loyalty that transcends nations. The Bourbon dynasty may have fallen, but the network that bound it remains, echoing through education, politics, and faith. The labyrinth is not a relic of Versailles. It is a structure that survived its collapse, an unseen architecture still shaping history. Thus, the Bourbon story cannot be told without the Jesuits, for they were the silent custodians of its fate. They were the voice in the king's ear, the pen in the secret council, the hand that held the key to both faith and obedience. They ensured that every mask the dynasty wore, every display of light, every hidden pact was entangled in threads that led back to Rome. The labyrinth they created was invisible, yet its presence was undeniable, and within it the Bourbons walked like actors on a stage whose script had already been written. Amid the glittering processions of Versailles, where courtiers paraded through marble halls and choirs echoed beneath vaulted ceilings, there appeared objects that seemed out of place, relics that carried a weight older than the dynasty itself. Among them were icons known as the Black Madonnas, dark-skinned images of the Virgin carried in solemn processions, veiled with mystery, and revered with a devotion that felt more ancient than Catholic ritual alone. To the faithful, they were holy figures, protectors in times of plague, famine, or war. To those who looked deeper, they were symbols of a continuity that predated both Bourbon and Vatican, echoes of goddesses absorbed but never erased. Their presence within Bourbon pageantry was no accident. It was another reminder that beneath splendor lay threads of secrecy. The origin of these Black Madonnas has long puzzled scholars and believers alike. Some claim they were early depictions darkened by candle smoke. Others suggest they were intentional, embodying a more primordial image of divinity linked to earth and fertility. Yet their persistence in Bourbon, France raises questions. Why did a dynasty so intent on projecting solar radiance with Louis XIV as the Sun King embrace processions centered around icons cloaked in shadow? Why did Versailles, the Palace of Light, harbor devotion to figures carved in darkness? The paradox is striking, and it suggests that even in its grandest rituals, the dynasty acknowledged a hidden layer of belief inherited from ages forgotten. The Vatican tolerated, even sanctified, the veneration of these icons, yet unease surrounded them. Their features seemed to echo goddesses from older faiths: Isis of Egypt, Cybele of Rome, perhaps even figures venerated by the Templars in secret. For centuries, whispers linked the Black Madonnas to the hidden knowledge carried by the Knights, relics of an older order, suppressed yet never destroyed. To see them carried beneath Bourbon banners was to glimpse the survival of forbidden memory, repackaged as devotion, yet retaining its ancient resonance. The very act of placing them within royal ceremonies suggested that the dynasty sought not only legitimacy from Rome, but protection from forces older and darker than papal blessing. Processions of the Black Madonna were unlike other ceremonies. While Versailles dazzled with light, these processions carried an air of solemnity. Torches flickering against the icon's dark face, hymns rising in tones more mournful than triumphant. The people followed with reverence, sensing that this figure represented a form of intercession different from ordinary saints. Queens and kings bowed before the icon as if acknowledging a power beyond themselves, beyond even the Vatican. It was a moment when the mask slipped, revealing that beneath the theater of sovereignty lay a quiet admission of dependence upon mysteries too dangerous to name. There are accounts of these icons being invoked during crises, when plague threatened, when famine struck, when rebellion stirred. The Black Madonna was carried through the streets, her dark gaze fixed upon the suffering. Miracles were reported, though skeptics called them coincidence. Yet the persistence of her cult within Bourbon France, sanctioned by kings and tolerated by Rome, suggests that her presence was more than superstition. It was the survival of something that defied erasure, a thread connecting the dynasty to currents of belief deliberately buried by official history. The Bourbon kings, despite their splendor, bent before her, perhaps sensing that her shadow held a protection Rome itself could not offer. The symbolism of darkness within the Bourbon story cannot be ignored. The dynasty projected light, but it repeatedly embraced images of shadow, processions of Black Madonnas, rituals held at night, ceremonies guarded from public view. This tension mirrors the larger paradox, a throne that proclaimed sovereignty while kneeling to hidden authority. Just as the Templar curse haunted them with fire, the Black Madonna shadowed them with silence, embodying mysteries they could never fully control. Her presence at Versailles was both a blessing and a reminder, a sign that even the greatest monarchs served powers older than their crowns. Some chroniclers hinted that these icons carried within them relics of the Templars themselves, fragments smuggled from the East, statues once hidden in temples the knights built along pilgrimage routes. If true, then the Bourbon veneration of the Black Madonna was an unspoken acknowledgement of the very order their ancestors had destroyed. Imagine the irony: kings who had inherited the curse kneeling before icons linked to the cursed. Whether coincidence or deliberate act, the image endures. Bourbon processions carrying the face of a goddess hidden in Christian robes, as if paying tribute to a vow they could not escape. The Vatican archives may hold explanations, but silence persists. What remains are the icons themselves, still venerated in cathedrals across Europe. Their origins are debated but never resolved. They stand as physical evidence of continuity, of memory that resisted erasure. To walk among them today is to feel the same unease that surrounded Bourbon processions, a sense of reverence mixed with suspicion, awe mixed with fear. Their presence reminds us that beneath every page of official history lies a deeper layer, one written not in ink, but in images too powerful to destroy. Thus, the Bourbon dynasty, in parading Black Madonnas, revealed more than they intended. They revealed the survival of forbidden currents, the intertwining of crown, church, and mystery. Versailles may have projected sunlight, but its rituals acknowledged shadow. The dynasty bowed before icons that whispered of origins beyond their faith, beyond their legitimacy, beyond their control. In doing so, they showed that history is not a clean script, but a palimpsest, layers of belief and betrayal overlapping until truth is obscured. The Black Madonnas remain as witnesses, silent yet eloquent. Their dark faces reflect the dynasty's deepest paradox, light and shadow walking together, bound by vows never erased. When the reign of Louis XIV reached its zenith, the world beheld Versailles as the symbol of unshakable authority, a palace where mirrors captured sunlight and projected the image of a king who called himself the sun. Yet even as this brilliance dazzled Europe, an eclipse had already begun. Behind the golden surfaces and orchestrated rituals, omens of collapse gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. The palace glowed in light, but its foundations trembled in silence. The Bourbon grandeur that seemed eternal was already threaded with decay, and those who looked closely sensed the shadow lengthening. The Sun King's court was a theater of perfection. Every gesture choreographed, every ritual designed to sustain the illusion of divine order. Courtiers rose and slept by the rhythm of his presence, as if he were not a man but a celestial body. Yet absolute control requires endless vigilance, and vigilance breeds exhaustion. Beneath the masks of splendor, discontent festered, peasants burdened by taxes, nobles stripped of independence, ministers caught between obedience and ambition. Versailles glittered, but beyond its gates, hunger gnawed and resentment grew. The eclipse of splendor began not with rebellion, but with silence, with the weight of burdens carried too long. Even within Versailles, the signs appeared. The king aged, his body racked with illness, his court filled with intrigue, his ministers plotting their own survival. The mirrors that once reflected radiance began to reflect frailty, the light bending around wrinkles, weariness, and doubt. Still, the rituals continued. The mask never slipped. The theater persisted. Yet those who stood near him could not ignore the growing shadow. They whispered of judgments deferred, debts unpaid, bargains with Rome that chained the dynasty more tightly than ever. The Sun King's light dazzled, but the eclipse was advancing. The Vatican's influence deepened during these years. While Versailles staged its rituals of independence, the papacy tightened its hold, ensuring the dynasty remained obedient. Disputes over appointments, confessions, and policy ended not with sovereign decree, but with compromises dictated from Rome. The king who proclaimed himself absolute was, in truth, bound by invisible treaties. His authority was circumscribed by obligations the people never saw. This contradiction gnawed at the core of his rule, eroding the very image of sovereignty he sought to project. Splendor became a mask stretched over weakness, and the eclipse darkened further. The eclipse also manifested in omens recorded by those who lived through the age, fires breaking out in the palace without cause, sudden deaths among heirs, comets blazing across the night sky. Storms tearing through gardens designed to mimic divine order. Such events might be dismissed as chance, but for those steeped in prophecy, they were signs of judgment. The curse of Jacques de Molay seemed to stir once more, reminding crown and church alike that their pact had not erased the vow spoken in fire. Each omen was a shadow falling across the brilliance of Versailles, a warning that the dynasty's light would not endure forever. Among courtiers, unease grew. They performed their roles, attended feasts, whispered compliments, yet their diaries reveal fear. They sensed that the dynasty's foundations were fragile, that the glitter could not conceal cracks forever. Some compared Versailles to Babylon, radiant yet doomed, or to Rome before its fall, magnificent but hollow. These whispers were dangerous, yet they persisted, for the eclipse was visible to all who dared to look beyond the mask. Even ministers loyal to the king admitted privately that the monarchy stood not on unshakable stone, but on shifting shadows. Louis XIV himself may have sensed the eclipse. His final years were marked by austerity, by regret for wars that drained his realm, by sorrow at the loss of heirs. The king who once embodied light now faced darkness. And though he continued the rituals, the brilliance of Versailles could not dispel the gloom. His death in 1715 was mourned. Yet beneath mourning was relief, as though the kingdom had been freed from the weight of a sun that no longer shone. The eclipse had claimed him, and though the dynasty continued, the shadow remained. The eclipse of splendor is more than a metaphor for decline. It is the embodiment of the paradox at the heart of Bourbon rule. Splendor dazzled, but it concealed debts, bargains, betrayals, and curses. Light blinded the world to the darkness that gathered behind it. And when the eclipse came, it revealed what had always been hidden, a dynasty bound not by divine right alone, but by fragile bargains struck in secrecy. Versailles itself, for all its brilliance, became a monument to that contradiction, a palace of light haunted by shadow. History records the Sun King as triumphant, yet triumph fades. What endures is the silence that followed, the void left by splendor eclipsed. Versailles remains, its mirrors still reflecting, its gardens still stretching toward the horizon. Yet it is no longer a palace of power. It is a monument to fragility, a reminder that even the brightest light can be swallowed by shadow. The Bourbon dynasty believed they could dazzle forever. Yet the eclipse proved that every sun must set and every mask must one day reveal the face it conceals. And so the question lingers, like twilight stretching across marble halls. Was the eclipse of splendor the natural end of glory? Or was it the judgment of vows betrayed centuries earlier? Was the fall of light inevitable? Or was it summoned by secrets, by curses, by pacts written in Vatican ink? Versailles does not answer. Its mirrors only reflect, endlessly repeating the brilliance that once was. While shadows remind us of what was concealed, the eclipse remains, eternal and unresolved. The silent truth behind the legend of the Sun King. The story of the Bourbons is punctuated not only by splendor, but by silence, the kind of silence that swallows entire decrees as if they had never been written. Archives that should preserve centuries of governance reveal gaps. Missing edicts, treaties without signatures, proclamations announced then erased. It is as though history itself was rewritten by invisible hands, stripping away the evidence of decisions too dangerous to survive daylight. For a dynasty that lived through spectacle, its most telling truths are found in these voids, where absence becomes louder than presence. Royal edicts were the lifeblood of monarchy, the instruments by which kings shaped nations. Yet throughout Bourbon history, we encounter sudden voids. Proclamations that appear in drafts but vanish from final registers. Laws referred to in letters but missing from the archives. What explains these disappearances? Were they accidents of poor preservation or deliberate erasures designed to conceal agreements forged in secrecy with Rome? The consistency of these voids suggests design, a pattern of silence woven into the very narrative of the dynasty. One example lies in the disputes over church appointments. At times, Bourbon kings claimed authority to appoint bishops, asserting independence from Rome, yet entire decrees supporting this policy later vanish as if swallowed whole. In their place, we find only vague references to compromise, hints that agreements were struck outside official channels. The Vatican's influence is felt in these gaps, shaping policy invisibly by erasing records that would reveal submission. Thus, the archives preserve not sovereignty, but silence, a silence that whispers of obedience hidden beneath the mask of autonomy. Financial matters reveal similar shadows. Records of loans, debts, and papal indulgences appear incomplete. Trails end abruptly without explanation. Some suggest these missing documents concealed the extent of Bourbon dependence on Vatican funds, a dependence incompatible with the image of divine monarchy. To admit such debts would have shattered the illusion of independence, so the documents simply vanish, leaving behind an absence more suspicious than any record. Versailles projected abundance, but silence in the archives reminds us that abundance often rested on hidden obligations. The erasures extend even to matters of faith. Certain orders suppressed, others reinstated, decrees issued then reversed, yet the official explanation never survives. The Jesuit controversy is especially telling. Proclamations condemning them appear in fragments, then dissolve, as if rewritten to obscure the Vatican's triumph in forcing compliance. The disappearance of these documents suggests more than clerical error. It suggests deliberate concealment, an attempt to rewrite history so that submission appeared as sovereignty. Yet the gaps themselves expose the truth, for absence reveals the weight of what was hidden. To walk through Versailles is to sense this silence. The palace is filled with inscriptions, paintings, and mirrors, all proclaiming order and eternity. Yet behind them lies a narrative riddled with voids. The walls tell stories of triumph, but the archives reveal omissions, decisions unrecorded, agreements hidden. This contrast forms the paradox of Bourbon history, a dynasty that declared its permanence in stone, but allowed its true foundations to vanish into silence. It is as if the palace itself was built not only to project glory, but to distract from the erasures beneath. The Vatican's role in this silence is undeniable. Its archives, deeper and more guarded than those of any monarchy, may still hold the missing decrees, but they remain sealed, their contents hidden from scholars, protected as if they contain truths too volatile to release. If those documents were revealed, what would they show? Agreements trading independence for legitimacy, concessions disguised as sovereignty, evidence of bargains struck in shadows. The very act of concealment suggests their danger. For why preserve and hide if there is nothing to fear? The Revolution exposed fragments of this silence. When archives were opened, scattered documents hinted at vanished treaties, agreements never meant to be seen. Some were destroyed by fire, others smuggled away, ensuring that the gaps remained. The Revolution may have toppled thrones, but it did not erase the Vatican's grip on memory. The silence continued even as blood flowed in the streets, as if the curse of secrecy could outlive even the guillotine. What makes these vanished edicts most unsettling is their continuity. They span centuries, affecting different kings and different policies, yet always producing the same effect: gaps in history where the truth should stand. The pattern suggests not error but intention, a deliberate rewriting of the record to shape perception. In this light, history becomes less a mirror than a mask, reflecting only what was permitted, concealing what was real. The Bourbon dynasty may have dazzled the world, but its archives reveal the cost of spectacle, silence purchased with truth. And so the question lingers: what was erased and why were these edicts removed? To protect the image of monarchy, to shield the dynasty from accusations of weakness, or were they erased to protect Rome? Concealing the extent of its control over kings who proclaim themselves divine, the answers remain hidden, locked within vaults that may never open. Yet absence itself is testimony, for silence is not emptiness. Silence is a choice, a veil drawn across truth, a reminder that the story of the Bourbons is written as much in what we cannot read as in what we can. While France projected the splendor of Versailles, another stage of Bourbon power unfolded across the Pyrenees. In Spain, the dynasty ruled with crowns inherited through marriage and war. Yet the silence that marked France also haunted Madrid. Here too, decrees vanished, treaties dissolved without explanation, and the Vatican's shadow extended into chambers where sovereignty should have been absolute. The Spanish Bourbons, heirs of the same bloodline, found themselves ensnared by the same hidden pacts, their kingdoms chained by obligations that could never be admitted openly. The Spanish silence was not an absence of history, but a deliberate muting of truths too dangerous to reveal. The War of the Spanish Succession itself carried the mark of these invisible strings. The Vatican, though outwardly neutral, exerted quiet influence to ensure Catholic supremacy, guiding alliances behind the veil of diplomacy. When Philip the Fair, grandson of Louis the Foreigner, claimed the Spanish throne, his legitimacy rested not only on blood but also on papal sanction. The Vatican's approval became the seal without which his crown would crumble. And so treaties were forged in secrecy, binding Spain to obligations whispered rather than written. What was gained in sovereignty was paid for in obedience, a bargain the Spanish Bourbons inherited as heavily as their French kin. Patterns of silence appear in Spanish records much as in France. Royal decrees regarding church lands, taxation, or Jesuit influence appear incomplete. Trails cut off mid-sentence. Laws reversed with no explanation. The archives are not gaps by accident but by design, as though hands carefully removed pages that might reveal too much. Scholars searching for continuity find only absence, and in that absence, the Vatican's influence is unmistakable. The Spanish silence mirrors the French, suggesting not coincidence but coordination, as though both branches of the dynasty operated under the same hidden covenant. The Jesuit labyrinth also wound through Spain, entangling kings in networks of obedience. Expulsions were ordered, only to be reversed. Edicts condemning the order vanished just as they had in France, leaving behind only rumors of secret negotiations. The pattern is undeniable. Wherever the Bourbons ruled, silence followed. And within that silence, Rome's influence thrived. Sovereignty was proclaimed, but obedience was performed, leaving behind a record more notable for its absences than its declarations. The Spanish court also turned to sacred icons during times of crisis, mirroring the French devotion to Black Madonnas. Processions carried relics through cities stricken by plague or famine. The people bowed in hope while kings observed in solemnity. These rituals linked Spain to the same undercurrent of older faiths, absorbed but never erased, suggesting that the Bourbon reliance on shadowed symbols was not confined to Versailles. The Spanish silence extended beyond archives into ceremonies where unspoken fears were cloaked in ritual. Wars drained the Spanish treasury. Rebellions stirred in colonies. And yet silence persisted. Decisions that shaped entire continents, policies in the Americas, alliances in Europe, often lack complete documentation, as though their true origins were buried deliberately. This void suggests that the Vatican's role reached beyond Europe, shaping imperial policy through channels invisible to ordinary history. The Spanish Bourbons, like their French relatives, ruled empires on paper, but remained tethered to Rome in reality. The silence was their inheritance, and it spread across oceans, binding colonies to decisions whispered in secret chambers thousands of miles away. The revolution in France echoed across Spain, stirring unease and rebellion, yet the Spanish Bourbons clung to power. Still the silence endured. Records of papal involvement in suppressing dissent, of Vatican guidance in colonial governance, remain incomplete or erased. It is as though history itself conspired to keep us from knowing the full extent of Rome's hand in preserving Bourbon rule abroad. And when Spain eventually faltered, losing colonies and struggling with internal upheaval, the silence proved as suffocating as the splendor of Versailles. To this day, the Spanish archives preserve the same unsettling pattern: gaps where treaties should stand, silences where explanations should lie. This continuity across two nations suggests something larger, a deliberate shaping of history at the highest level. The Bourbons ruled in light, but their obedience was written in shadow, erased before the world could see. The Spanish silence, like the French, is not emptiness, but evidence. Evidence of a dynasty that survived only by binding itself to a pact it could never acknowledge. And so we are left with the same haunting question. Was this silence the price of survival or the evidence of betrayal? Did the Spanish Bourbons, like their French kin, inherit not only crowns but also chains forged in Rome? Chains concealed by erasure. The archives do not answer. Yet their gaps whisper louder than words, reminding us that silence is not forgetfulness but design. The Spanish silence remains, echoing the fate of Versailles, a shadow across history that no light has yet dispelled. Behind the golden masks of monarchy and the solemn robes of the church, another pursuit thrived in secret: the search for transformation through alchemy within the courts of the Bourbons. Whispers tell of chambers where philosophers' stones were sought, elixirs distilled, and metals tested in crucibles, not as idle curiosities, but as desperate attempts to grasp forbidden power. These experiments, cloaked in secrecy, unfolded alongside the glittering ceremonies of Versailles and the councils of Rome, suggesting that beneath the polished theater of legitimacy lay an undercurrent of desperation. The dynasty that seemed to command everything still yearned for more: immortality, perfection, absolution from the curse that haunted them. Alchemy was no stranger to royal courts. From the Middle Ages onward, kings sought its promises of wealth and eternal life. Yet in Bourbon, France, and Spain, its presence carried a darker resonance. These were not innocent curiosities, but rituals conducted under cover of night, sometimes in collaboration with clerics who blurred the line between science and sacrament. Did the Vatican sanction these experiments, or merely tolerate them so long as they remained hidden? The silence of the archives suggests complicity, for had the church wished to denounce them openly, it could have done so. Instead, fragments survive only in letters, in coded manuscripts, in rumors passed down like contraband. Consider the irony: a dynasty that proclaimed itself chosen by heaven turning to furnaces and flasks in pursuit of salvation. The philosopher's stone promised more than gold. It promised transcendence, a way to escape mortality itself. For a line cursed by fire, bound by secrecy, threatened by revolt, such promises were irresistible. Yet to seek them was to step into dangerous territory, where science blurred into heresy, and where ancient knowledge, perhaps even remnants of Templar lore, resurfaced in new forms. Alchemy at court was not only about transformation of matter, but transformation of fate. Versailles, outwardly a palace of order, contained chambers where experiments unfolded in silence. Courtiers spoke of laboratories hidden behind walls, guarded by secrecy, where scholars mixed powders and traced symbols said to date back to Egypt. In Spain, similar stories surfaced of kings consulting mystics who promised to unlock secrets carried from the East. Were these mere diversions for rulers weary of war and politics, or deliberate attempts to harness forbidden knowledge to break the curse and secure eternity? The absence of records leaves us uncertain, but the persistence of rumors suggests that something more than curiosity was at play. The Jesuits appear again in this shadowed pursuit. Known for their mastery of science as well as theology, they sometimes stood at the edges of these experiments, guiding kings while keeping Rome informed. Did they serve as protectors of orthodoxy, ensuring heresy never crossed the line, or as gatekeepers of knowledge, deciding which secrets might be revealed and which must remain buried? The Vatican's silence on these matters is perhaps the greatest testimony of all. If alchemy threatened faith, why allow it? Unless, of course, some of its promises were too useful to discard. Legends tell of one Bourbon king receiving a mysterious gift: a book bound in black leather, filled with symbols indecipherable to ordinary eyes. Some claimed it was a Templar relic smuggled from the East and preserved through centuries of secrecy. Others said it came from the Vatican archives themselves, released under condition of obedience. The book promised transformation, but it also demanded sacrifice. Its pages spoke of fire, of vows. Whether real or imagined, such stories reveal the desperation of rulers who, despite their crowns, sought refuge in mysteries older than Christianity itself. Alchemy at court was more than a private obsession. It seeped into politics. Gold conjured through experiment could fund wars without taxation. Elixirs of longevity could promise continuity of rule. Hidden knowledge could strengthen the dynasty against enemies seen and unseen. Yet the pursuit always carried danger. Failure led to ruin, exposure to ridicule, discovery to condemnation. This may explain why so many records vanish, why experiments are whispered of but never described openly. The silence protects not innocence, but guilt. For to admit the extent of these pursuits would shatter the carefully constructed mask of divine legitimacy. The curse of Demolay also resonates here. A dynasty haunted by fire might turn to alchemy, not simply for wealth, but to master the very element that destroyed its accuser, to transform fire into light, base matter into gold, mortality into eternity. These were attempts to reverse the judgment of history itself. If successful, the Bourbons might have broken the curse, proving themselves masters of the same forces that condemned their ancestors. Yet success never came, and each experiment only deepened the shadow, reminding them that no furnace could burn away the silence of betrayal. To walk through Versailles today is to find no trace of laboratories, no crucibles or flasks. Yet silence itself suggests their existence. For absence can be more revealing than presence. The palace proclaims order, but the rumors of alchemy remind us of disorder beneath. The Bourbon kings, for all their power, turned to forbidden arts, binding themselves not only to Rome, but also to mysteries Rome itself sought to control. Their experiments remain shadows, their results unknown, but their persistence across centuries reveals a dynasty not at peace with its fate, but restless, searching, desperate to rewrite destiny. Thus, the story of alchemy at court becomes another chapter in the larger paradox, a dynasty radiant with light, yet haunted by shadow, proclaiming divine legitimacy, yet seeking forbidden power. Dazzling the world with splendor, yet whispering to fire in secret. Whether their experiments produced miracles or nothing at all no longer matters. What matters is the silence, the erasures, the fragments that survive like embers in ash. They remind us that the Bourbons, despite their brilliance, were never content, never secure, never free. They sought transformation, but instead revealed fragility, leaving us with the haunting question of whether their pursuit of forbidden knowledge hastened the curse rather than lifted it. Deep within the Vatican's guarded chambers lies a silence more unsettling than any spoken word. Among the sealed archives, beneath frescoed ceilings and behind iron doors, rests what many have called the Concordat of Silence. An understanding between Bourbon monarchs and Rome, never proclaimed, never published, but enforced with a rigor surpassing law. It was not a single document, perhaps not even a single event, but a chain of understandings passed through generations, designed to conceal as much as to bind. What emerged from this hidden concordat was not only obedience, but erasure, a rewriting of history that left us with fragments, voids, and unanswered questions. The Bourbon dynasty proclaimed sovereignty, yet its survival depended on agreements it could never acknowledge. The Vatican, mastering the art of secrecy, ensured that these understandings left little trace, preserved only in whispers, in erased edicts, in decisions that seemed to reverse themselves without explanation. The Concordat was not about open allegiance. It was about silence, a silence that guarded the church's authority while permitting the monarchy to shine in borrowed light. Both institutions benefited, yet both became prisoners of the silence they maintained. Consider the paradox. Versailles glittered as the stage of divine monarchy, while beneath its brilliance, decisions were dictated by agreements no one could speak of. Kings performed sovereignty, but in hidden chambers they accepted conditions that betrayed it. Rome offered legitimacy, but in exchange demanded compliance, ensuring that no Bourbon decree strayed too far from papal interests. The silence was not absence, but design, a veil drawn across truths that could unravel the entire illusion. If the public had known the extent of these bargains, the divine mask of monarchy would have shattered. The evidence of this concordat lies not in what survives, but in what is missing. Erased decrees, vanished financial records, censored correspondence. Each absence is a testimony to the pact. When policies shifted without explanation, when alliances dissolved suddenly, when entire archives fell silent, the invisible hand of the concordat can be felt. History does not need to show the document. The void it left is proof enough. Silence itself is the seal of the Vatican, the unbroken signature of the fisherman's ring across the centuries. The revolution revealed fragments, but even its violence could not pierce the heart of Vatican secrecy. When archives were seized and palaces ransacked, what surfaced were hints, references to negotiations, whispers of secret councils, notes half-burned that suggested deeper agreements hidden elsewhere. It was as though the true documents had been spirited away long before the fall, protected by Rome as treasures more dangerous than relics. Even as kings lost their heads, the Concord endured, unseen but unbroken, its silence echoing across the ruins of monarchy. Some have speculated that the Concordat was more than political, that it carried within it theological concessions, agreements about relics, rituals, and perhaps even knowledge forbidden to ordinary faith. The Black Masses, the survival of alchemical traditions, the persistence of Templar echoes. Were these tolerated only because they were woven into the hidden bargains? If so, then the Concordat preserved not only obedience, but also the survival of mysteries that could not be acknowledged. The silence in this light becomes less a denial than a containment, ensuring that dangerous truths remain sealed within the vaults of both palace and cathedral. The Jesuits, ever present in shadows, were likely its custodians. Their loyalty to Rome, their presence in confessions and councils, made them ideal guardians of agreements that could never be written plainly. They were the scribes of silence, ensuring continuity across reigns and reminding each king of obligations inherited rather than chosen. Their sudden expulsions and quiet returns mirrored the rhythm of the Concordat itself, erased from view yet always present, always binding, always returning. What makes the Concordat of Silence most haunting is its endurance. Dynasties fall, revolutions rise, but silence persists. The Bourbon line may have collapsed in blood, yet the Vatican remains, its archives sealed, its control of memory unbroken. The Concordat continues not as parchment, but as a principle, that truth may be buried when survival demands it, and that power is preserved not by revelation, but by concealment. In this way, silence becomes the greatest weapon, more enduring than sword or crown. To stand in Versailles today, to walk its gilded halls, is to sense the echo of this silence. The mirrors reflect light, but they do not reveal what was concealed. The walls whisper of treaties, councils, and pacts, yet none of them appear in the record. The palace is a monument not only to grandeur, but to absence, a stage built to distract us from what was never shown. The Vatican's silence ensured the Bourbon mask remained intact until the very end, when the blade revealed what silence could no longer protect. And yet the question endures, what truths were contained within that silence? And why are they still hidden? Were they secrets of faith, of politics, of betrayal, or of knowledge too dangerous for any age? The Vatican does not answer, and the archives remain sealed. The Concordat of Silence whispers through absence, leaving us with only suspicion, only fragments, only the chilling realization that history as we know it was curated by erasure. The silence is not empty. It is deliberate, unbroken, eternal. On the eve of collapse, Versailles glowed as if determined to deny the truth. Feasts continued, music played, courtiers danced beneath chandeliers, and wine spilled across golden tables. Yet those who attended felt a strange chill, as though each toast carried an omen, each dish concealed a warning. The final banquets of the Bourbon dynasty were more than celebrations. They were rituals of defiance, attempts to mask fear with excess. The grandeur of the Sun King's palace still dazzled, but beneath the laughter lingered silence, a silence that foretold endings. Accounts from those nights reveal a curious mixture of extravagance and unease. Guests noted how the king raised his glass with words that seemed rehearsed, as if meant to reassure not only his court but himself. Servants whispered of symbols etched into goblets, coded marks that only a few understood. Courtiers exchanged glances heavy with meaning, uncertain whether they celebrated triumph or presided over the opening of a tomb. The banquets felt like theater, a performance where every gesture masked dread. Food itself became ritual. Dishes were presented with symbolic precision, white bread recalling purity, red wine poured like blood, roasted animals carved in patterns said to echo sacrificial rites. Was this merely extravagance? Or was it an unconscious reenactment of offerings meant to appease powers beyond mortal control? A dynasty haunted by curses and chained to hidden pacts? Feasting became more than indulgence. It became a final prayer, a desperate attempt to buy time with ritual disguised as appetite. At one banquet, chroniclers noted strange toasts. Ministers lifted glasses and spoke in phrases that seemed harmless but carried layered meanings. References to dawn, to fire, to blood, to silence. These coded toasts have puzzled historians, yet within the context of bourbon secrecy, they resemble acknowledgments of hidden obligations. Perhaps they were affirmations of loyalty to Rome, perhaps veiled confessions of fear, perhaps attempts to summon blessings from shadows no one dared name aloud. Whatever their purpose, they transformed banquets into ceremonies, feasts into unspoken counsels. The irony of these final gatherings is stark. While peasants starved beyond palace walls, while unrest grew louder in the streets, Versailles drowned itself in abundance. Yet the abundance felt hollow, as though everyone present knew the mass could not last. Guests wrote afterward that the laughter rang strangely, that the music felt heavy, that the mirrors reflected not joy but unease. The palace glowed, but the glow seemed forced, as if it strained against encroaching darkness. The banquets were not celebrations of permanence, but farewells dressed in gold. Legends tell of one last banquet where an icon of the Black Madonna was present, carried quietly into the chamber and placed near the head of the table. Some claimed the queen herself insisted, seeking her protection. Others said it was the suggestion of confessors, a desperate appeal to powers older than Rome. The presence of the dark figure amid the glittering feast created an unsettling image, light and shadow sharing the same table, splendor and dread intertwined. Did the dynasty believe she could intercede? Or was her presence merely acknowledgement that no feast could drown the curse? The Vatican's shadow also reached into these final nights. Envoys were present, seated discreetly, watching with eyes that revealed nothing. Their presence reminded everyone that Rome still bound the crown, even as collapse loomed. Did they record the coded toasts, the whispered fears, the final bargains made behind curtains after the music faded? The Vatican archives remain silent. Yet one suspects that even in downfall, the dynasty renewed its pact, sealing silence with wine and bread. The banquets were not only farewells to monarchy, but reaffirmations of secrecy, binding agreements, even as the blade approached. What is most haunting is the sense of inevitability. Those who attended described dreams of fire, of voices in the night, of mirrors cracking as though under unseen pressure. The banquets became stages for prophecy where the future hovered like a specter over every gesture. Guests sensed that they dined not in triumph but in judgment, that their glasses clinked not in celebration but in mourning. Each toast echoed with the weight of centuries, with the vow of Jacques de Molay, with the silence of erased decrees, with the shadow of Rome's hidden hand. When revolution finally arrived, Versailles stood silent, its halls emptied of music, its mirrors reflecting only absence. The banquets were remembered not as triumphs, but as preludes to ruin. The coded toasts, the symbolic dishes, the uneasy laughter all became part of the legend, evidence that the dynasty had known its end before it came. The feasts did not avert the curse. They confirmed it, transforming dining tables into altars, turning final meals into offerings swallowed by history. And so the banquets remain, not as celebrations, but as shadows. They reveal the paradox of bourbon power, a dynasty that fed itself on spectacle even as silence consumed it, a monarchy that toasted eternity even as time collapsed. The last banquets were not meals, but mirrors reflecting a dynasty that had always been bound, always been haunted, always been one step away from fire. Versailles glowed, but the glow was farewell, a final flicker before darkness claimed the Palace of Mirrors. When the blade fell upon Louis XVI in 1793, it did more than end a reign. It sealed centuries of dread, silence, and bargains struck in secrecy. The Bourbon dynasty, once radiant in Versailles, collapsed not with whispers, but with the roar of revolution, a roar that echoed the vow spoken by Jacques de Molay as flames consumed him centuries earlier. The fall was sudden, yet it felt preordained, as if history itself had been waiting for the final act of judgment. Fire had become blade, and the oath in ashes had found its fulfillment in blood. The revolution did not erase the Vatican's presence, nor did it dissolve the web of silence. Instead, it revealed how deeply the dynasty had been entangled in agreements never meant to see light. When archives were seized, when palaces were ransacked, fragments surfaced, half-burned notes, letters referring to meetings unnamed, treaties that dissolved into gaps. The concordat of silence endured, for even in collapse, the most dangerous truths were already hidden in Rome, sealed away before the guillotine ever rose. The fall of the Bourbons was therefore not only political but symbolic, the visible unmasking of a dynasty that had always been bound. Louis XVI's walked to his death as a man burdened not only by revolution, but by inheritance. His ancestors had built Versailles to project permanence, yet had signed away autonomy in hidden councils. They had raised black Madonnas in procession, sought alchemy in secret chambers, toasted coated toasts in gilded banquets, all in a desperate attempt to balance sovereignty with obedience, fear with hope, curse with faith. By the time the guillotine awaited, the dynasty's fate was already inscribed in the silence of centuries. His fall was not a surprise. It was the inevitable echo of vows made long before his birth. Even after the monarchy crumbled, whispers of the curse persisted. Some claimed the Bourbon line was extinguished. Others insisted that heirs survived, carrying with them the shadow of silence. Exiled branches of the family clung to their titles, their names, their memories, as if survival alone could outlast the weight of history. Yet, wherever the bloodlines spread, in Spain, in Italy, in fragments across Europe, turmoil followed: wars, uprisings, assassinations, betrayals. The curse did not die with the revolution. It endured, shifting shape but keeping its presence, a shadow trailing every descendant. Versailles itself became a monument to absence. Its halls, once alive with music and ritual, stood empty, mirrors reflecting silence where once they had reflected splendor. Tourists later marveled at its beauty, yet even they sensed unease, a grandeur hollowed by collapse. The palace outlived its kings, but it carried their secrets within its stones. Walking through its gardens is to feel the tension between light and shadow, between the glory it projects and the silence it conceals. Versailles is not only a palace of history, it is a tomb of memory, guarding secrets that still refuse to surface. The Vatican, too, endured, guarding its archives as tightly as ever. The Concordat of Silence remained intact, for the fall of the Bourbons did not erase what had been hidden. If anything, it reinforced the Vatican's mastery of silence. For while kings died, the Church survived, its vaults sealed, its influence unbroken. What truths lie within those chambers remain unknown, though suspicion insists they contain the dangerous agreements that bound crowns to Rome, agreements that perhaps carried the very seeds of monarchy's destruction. Silence outlived splendor, as it always does. The oath of doom, the curse in ashes, still lingers in the imagination. Was it truly supernatural, or was it simply the inevitability of betrayal exacting its price? Perhaps both. The curse lived not only in fire, but in memory, and memory itself is a kind of judgment. The Bourbons betrayed the guardians of forbidden truths, allied themselves with the very institution that had orchestrated betrayal, and then bound their fate to it in secrecy. Their collapse was not chance, it was consequence. The revolution was the blade, but the hand that lifted it was centuries in the making. And so the Bourbon dynasty fell in blood and fire. Yet its shadow endures. It lingers in the silence of archives, in the gaps of history, in the suspicion that what we know has been rewritten, curated, erased. The curse remains not as superstition, but as a reminder. What is concealed will one day demand reckoning. What is betrayed will one day return. Versailles glows still, but its light is haunted. Its mirrors reflect absence, and its silence reminds us that truth is never destroyed, only buried. Now the palace grows quiet, its gardens fading into shadow, its fountains still. The laughter of courtiers has dissolved into silence, and the mirrors that once multiplied sunlight now reflect only the dim outlines of those who wander through centuries later. The Bourbon dynasty has ended, yet its story has not closed. For silence is not an ending, but a door left ajar. The Vatican vaults remain sealed, the archives of Europe still fractured, the whispers of curses still alive in the imagination of those who seek patterns in the void. Perhaps the truth will never emerge. Perhaps it has already been rewritten beyond recognition. But the absence itself is a kind of presence, reminding us that power often hides its most dangerous truths not in what it declares, but in what it conceals. Versailles stands as both monument and mask, dazzling the eye while guarding the silence beneath. The Bourbon name lingers not in splendor but in shadow, echoing across history as both triumph and warning. So we leave the story here with a candle dimming in an endless hallway of mirrors. The light fades, the echo softens, and silence settles once more. Yet somewhere in vaults no one may enter, the forgotten pages remain waiting for a hand bold enough to lift the veil. Until then, the Bourbon dynasty endures not in memory of its kings, but in the shadow of what was never told.